Ogada. Evans Ogada for the 6th and 7th petitioners. Your Lordship, your Ladyship, I pick up from where Senior Counsel Otiende Amolo left, and he equated this court to the bastion and bulwark of constitutionalism in this country. Quickly, in terms of comparative constitutional law, the year is 1919, August 11th specifically, whereby the Weimar Republic ushers a new constitution after the fall of Germany. That constitution is important for this reason. It had a Bill of Rights, and it properly recognized the individual as the locus of authority, just like our Constitution 2010. That constitution had a shelf life of 3 years. It failed. Why did that constitution fail? For these reasons. One, it was deliberately undermined by legislation under it. Two, it was deliberately undermined by political action. Your Ladyship, your Lordship, you are the bulwark, the bastion of constitutionalism. And we have submitted to you our authority number 1, page 1 to 72 of our bundle of authorities, that legality, the principle of legality, is one of the tools that the judiciary uses to examine the acts of state. Your Lordship, Justice Mugambi, you asked a question on public participation. It has been flogged enough, but I want to give precise bullet point answers. Public participation is a principle enacted to address limitations of representative government. Therefore, if I had time, I will take us to the history of democracy in its incipient stage, whereby we used to sit as Africans around tables and make decisions through consensus. There's a tool called the Boule, B-O-U-L-E. The Greeks had the Agora, whereby decisions were made from a small platform. That is what public participation intends to do, to take us to that environment where decisions were given meaning and at least accounted for. Secondly, Your Lordship, legislators do not always represent the views of the people. In theory, they are supposed to. In fact, they do not. Our first past the post electoral system has ensured that certain ethnic minorities are excluded by the majoritarian interests, and therefore they are dominated, excluded from governance. That is why public participation and the need to account for the views given is important. The mechanisms that facilitate effective public participation ensure that these people are respected. They are included in the democratic cog. I will not belabor public participation further. There is the BAT case that issued guidelines. I had a position here that Parliament is considering legislation on public participation. I take a different view. Once the Supreme Court has synthesized and distilled the elements of public participation, given as constitutional law, qua Article 94 of the Constitution, that is law. Parliament has no business legislating on it. So the guiding light for this court, in terms of what amounts to public participation, we go to the BAT case by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, echoing what George Vincent Odunga J in Ex parte Gekuru, those two decisions give a conjunctive test. There's a qualitative and quantitative element to public participation. Those elements have not been met. I simply move next to the impugned notice by the Cabinet Secretary in charge of housing, ostensibly in exercise of powers under Section 84, read together with Section 31 of the Employment Act. Error under the law, Section 2 of the Employment Act, as read with Section 91 of the Employment Act, the authority to make rules and any instrument worth calling itself a statutory instrument under the Employment Act is within the domain of the Cabinet Secretary in charge of labor matters, not the CS Housing and Transport. I can almost bet my dime that I will be told there is the principle of collective responsibility, and therefore any CS can do what was done in those impugned notices. Those of us who studied law at second year remember the principle of delegatus non delegare potest. A delegate cannot delegate any further. So when you are a CS and statute delegates to you authority to make rules, that has to be read with the interconnectedness with Article 94. And therefore, when Parliament, through the Employment Act, specifically identifies the officer that is the Cabinet Secretary for Employment, that Cabinet Secretary cannot delegate it any further. My brother Ochiel has submitted, and others have submitted, on the Statutory Instruments Act. That act has to be read together with the provisions of the Interpretation and General Provisions Act. The following provisions complement the provisions of the Statutory Instruments Act. Your Lordships, your Ladyships, Section 27 of that Act. All subsidiary legislation have to be published in the Gazette and shall come into operation on the day of publication. Important. The question is, this notice appointing KRA as an agent, in addition to the shortfalls identified with the Statutory Instruments Act, impugns Section 27. Retrospective application, Section 28 of that Act answers us. I will invite the court to look at it. Section 33 of this Act, acts done under subsidiary legislation are deemed to be done under the Act which authorizes it. Again, buttressing our argument, Section 2, Section 91 of the Employment Act, the Cabinet Secretary who ought to have issued guidelines, who ought to have appointed KRA, if at all, was the Cabinet Secretary in charge of employment matters, not labor. Employment and labor matters, not housing. Section 34 requires that any instrument in the nature of rules and regulations has to be laid before the National Assembly. The notice, the impugned notice and the agency notice to KRA holds out in its Austinian sense. John Austin. We were forced to obey the command and we remit taxes or levy, whatever it's called, ostensibly because of those rules. Your Lordship, those rules ought to have been submitted to the National Assembly by virtue of Section 34 of this Act. In conclusion, and as I wind up, a lot has been said about policy, that this court ought to keep off political questions. The lead decision of Justice Joel Ngugi in the BBI case, David D. and others, ably captures the authority of this court as captured in Article 165, such that merely a threat to the Constitution is an invitation for this court to deal with that threat whenever it occurs. The Constitution 2010 baptizes this court as a Kelsenian court. This is a court that is supposed to do judicial review. And judicial review under the context of the Constitution 2010 and reading specifically the principal provisions, Article 10, the Constitution 2010 mandates this court to even examine policy considerations, however crafted. Anything that lacks legitimacy cannot be effective. Lacking in effectiveness, they cannot develop legitimacy. Those are not my words, those are the words of Samuel Huntington, third wave or democratization in the late 20th century, attacks in political science. Basically, anything that was not procedurally proper, constitutionally infirm, cannot be a material of governance. Anything done without according to the authority of the people as the sovereign locus under the Constitution 2010 cannot be baptized, cannot be solemnized by an imprimatur of this court. We humbly submit. Thank you.